Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Atlantic Council IRI event about Montenegro's elections. I'm Valerie Hopkins. I'm the Southeast Europe Correspondent of the Financial Times, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion with Paul McCarthy of IRI and Damon Wilson of the Atlantic Council. I think many of us who are on this call have probably been gotten used to the state of affairs in Montenegro, shall we say, taken some things for granted, but it's 2020 and so many things in our lives have been changing, and it looks like possibly the politics in Montenegro as well. So as this wonderful and small country on the Adriatic looks poised to potentially change its governance through elections for the first time in its history, I think it's a fantastic timing to have a discussion about the results of the election and what they could mean for Montenegro's democracy, for its geopolitical orientation, and for its relations with traditional allies. So I'm very keen to have with us Paul and Damon. I think probably if you're on this call, you are already interested in the politics of Montenegro and know about the results of the election. But before I hand it over to Paul and Damon, I will just say that as most of you probably know, the ruling Democratic Party of Socialists only earned 30 seats. Its traditional allies won another 10, so it's giving it just short of a majority that it might need in the 81 seat parliament. The opposition did win 41 seats, but it looks like a lot of things are still in play. Of course, the important thing to remember is that President Milo Djukanovic, who is also the president of the Democratic Party of Socialists, will remain as president, I think until 2022 or 2023 even. So certain things are not changing anytime soon. But there is still a lot that remains unclear. And for that, I'm really looking forward to handing it over to Paul first, Paul McCarthy, who began his career at IRI in October 2004 and has worked in the Middle East and North Africa division. He's been the director of the Europe division since 2018, where he's responsible for overseeing a diverse portfolio of regional and country-specific programs. And then we will hear from Damon Wilson, who is the executive vice president of the Atlantic Council, serving as both a thought leader and manager with a responsibility for strategy and strategic initiatives, program development, and integration. He served from 2007 to 2009 as a special assistant to the president and senior director for European affairs at the National Security Council. Previously, he also served at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad as the executive secretary and chief of staff, and also worked at the National Security Council as the director of Central, Eastern, and Northern European affairs from 2004 to 2006. There's a lot more in the bio, but I think suffice it to say you have quite a lot of experience in this field, and I think I'll let your words and analysis speak for themselves. So maybe I can hand it over first to Paul. Why don't you tell us a bit more about the results and what you think they might mean in the coming weeks and months as Montenegro tries to form a new government, potentially with some new faces in power.
Thank you very much, Valerie. And I wanted to say thanks to you for joining us. You're an old friend of our program, and it's great to see you again. And also our co-host at the Atlantic Council, Damon Wilson. It's great to be working with you on this, and welcome everybody. These are indeed interesting elections, and I don't think a lot of us Balkan watchers really expected what was going to happen. When we were talking about putting this meeting together, we were thinking that this was going to be maybe the same old, with all of the challenges that Montenegro has been facing. But in a stunning result, the opposition ousted the ruling Democratic Party of Socialists, who have run the country for the past 3 decades. One of the dominant themes, I would say, and actually Valerie mentioned the results, which are very interesting. The opposition collectively won 41 seats in the 81-seat parliament, edging past the DPS, which managed only to reach 40 seats with allied parties. The opposition also did well in the local elections, particularly those cities along the coast. There were elections in 5 cities in these elections. One of the dominant themes of the election campaign was a controversial law that requires religious communities to prove property ownership. The Serbian Orthodox Church in Montenegro, the largest religious institution in the country, has claimed that the law was passed to rob it, as it says, to rob it of its property and restrict religious freedom. President Đukanović, the longtime leader of the DPS, strongly advocated for the religion law. His efforts to push the law through parliament earlier this year may have contributed to his party's defeat, as it brought out angry voters who identify as Serbs, around a third of the population, and who voted for the opposition parties. Turnout was very high, well over 75%. So it seems that this law may have brought some people out who didn't normally vote. Đukanović's iron grip on Montenegro also galvanized centrist civic parties who have been critical of the government's corruption and the way the DPS elite has ruled the small country as a thief for 30 years. Finally, Montenegro's economy has been negatively affected by COVID. GDP is expected to drop by 9% by the end of the year. A declining economy may have gone into Đukanović's calculations to hold the elections early rather than wait. Consisting of 3 coalitions, the opposition is a mixed bag and will most likely have trouble maintaining a stable government. The largest bloc for the future of Montenegro is an anti-EU coalition that advocates closer links with Serbia and Russia. The other 2 coalitions, Peace is Our Nation and Black on White, ran on more pro-EU, reformist, and anti-corruption platforms. Nevertheless, the opposition has vowed to continue honoring its international commitments and implementing reforms necessary to join the European Union. Montenegro is a NATO member, and it will be interesting to see how the pro-Moscow bloc in parliament handles the membership issue moving forward, despite what they've said so far. The Kremlin will naturally be eager to disrupt NATO from within, and I'm sure Damon will have a few more words to say about that. President Đukanović was quick to accuse Serbia's election meddling for his party's defeat. He said Belgrade was attempting to reabsorb Montenegro back into the old Yugoslav Federation, proving once again that history never really goes away in the Balkans. Sometimes it's only sleeping. Đukanović has spoken of Belgrade, Banja Luka, Podgorica triangle being formed through Serb efforts in particular. It was interesting to see the Serbian foreign minister, Ivica Dačić, who accused Đukanović of trying to establish a Tirana, Pristina, Skopje, Podgorica square, as opposed to a triangle, noting that Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama supported Đukanović before the election in a rather long-winded speech. Đukanović remains president until late next year and retains significant power. Đukanović has the constitutional power to pick a prime minister-elect. He has 30 days after the first sitting of parliament to give that mandate. In the meantime, Đukanović may try to peel away the Black on White coalition, which is the most pro-EU, pro-NATO part of the opposition. All eyes are now on Black on White leader Dritan Abazović, who with his 4 seats has become a kingmaker unexpectedly. The rest and majority, I would say, of the opposition is more Serb-aligned and pro-Russian. Despite calling for inter-ethnic harmony after the elections, the supporters of these parties are reported to attack ethnic minorities, and it was quite disturbing to see Bosniaks in Plevlje being attacked and their houses of worship being attacked. This can only worsen interethnic relations moving forward. So expect to see a power struggle between the president and parliament over the next 12 months. An election rerun is a distinct possibility due to a lack of agreement on a government. The good news in all of this is that Montenegro finally has political pluralism, which may aid the fight against corruption. The bad news is that political instability could make the country ripe for more outside authoritarian interference. That's it for me. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Paul, for that great overview. Damon, I mean, how do you see this, and how do you see this from the perspective in Washington? How are the people that you've been talking to in DC perceiving the result?
Thank you so much. First, let me just say, Valerie, it's great to be back here with you. I love your work and your coverage of the region, so thank you for doing this event. And it's great to be partnering with IRI. Paul, appreciate all the work you do, and IRI under Dan Twining is just doing fantastic work. So Valerie, you know, I've noticed a difference. There's some people who thought, oh my gosh, hair on fire, what's happened in Montenegro, Trojan horse and NATO, and others who actually perhaps have a little bit more responsibility towards policy are approaching this much more level-headed. This is a democracy, change is inevitable, this would come one day. And so I think there's a sense of calmness about how to think through this. So let me unpack it a little bit, because as Paul said, this is dramatic. It does represent a tectonic shift, a break in 30 years of DPS domination. Now, DPS has always had to form coalitions somehow, so it's not been, you know, outright in control, but it certainly has dominated over that period. And Đukanović can't be counted out. He remains as president. We'll have to see what cohabitation looks like, but you can't even count him out yet in where we are with the negotiations. This 41-40 means that there's going to be a lot of horse trading and politics behind the scenes. And you can't count out DPS on just yet. That said, I think even URA and the party leader, Black on White, they really did campaign against DPS. And so I think there's a predisposition to expect a coalition government and opposition to Đukanović that brings them together. And it's pretty easy to understand why this happened, even though it surprised some watchers. This is remarkable. Over 75% turnout when people are worried about COVID. Something was happening here, and that something was Đukanović deciding to take on the church directly head on in an election year, representing real overreach as it mobilized the church, made the church an overt political actor. Now, there are plenty of good reasons why Đukanović picked this battle, and you can look at how the Serbian Orthodox Church has been used in the past. If you unpacked even the campaign against NATO, the financing for that campaign, the work through that campaign, there's quite a bit of indication that the church had been used as conduit for some of these efforts in the past. That said, he picked a fight in overreaching perhaps, and that it mobilized both population and voters that felt strongly about it, but also mobilized forces in Belgrade and elsewhere to stand by and work with the church as a mobilizing factor. The second one was just kind of what's natural in a country where you have a leader, a party that's been in power for 30 years, a desire for change, and understanding the DPS domination of Montenegro over time wasn't healthy for Montenegro's democratic development, especially as it looks towards its path towards the European Union. So you end up with a coalition, a lot of Serb identified voters, in fact, voters that really didn't support the independence of Montenegro, combined with many people who just were sick of 30 years of DPS and wanted a change. And so what? So I think it's important that there be calm, that there not be panic. After all, this is what you want to see, that change arrives through elections, not through violence. This is a country, after all, plagued by a coup in 2016, a potential alleged coup in which Democratic Front leaders were directly implicated in that coup and are serving jail time for it. And so it's important that this is happening peacefully. Now, we've seen, as Paul said, some immediate reactions in the aftermath, which were disturbing, threatened Muslim populations across Bosnia and some specific incidents. And so it's been important to see the coalition leaders and the opposition speak out against violence. And I think they've got to be consistent on that front and reassuring to minority communities that might be concerned. They've made the right noises on meeting international obligations, code for NATO, but I think that's going to be a test, and it's the commitment towards the pathway for the EU and giving a nod of reassurance by saying we're interested in a government of technocrats. We'll have to see what that really means and where we go. And it also is, this is a kind of change that could help in those areas that many of you on this call track, where Montenegro has had shortcomings in media freedoms, in rule of law, and some of these corruption issues. This is where you could see actual progress on the agenda. But I think it's important to think about the guardrails going forward. Most of concern to someone like me who worked so hard with the people of Montenegro on their pathway to NATO is to understand that we were making a commitment to Montenegro and not to the DPS itself. It would not have happened without Djukanovic's leadership. But there's probably only maybe 25% of people in parliament who would really try to reverse that. And any government is going to have a razor thin majority. Aura, the blue on white coalition, has been very pro-EU, very pro-NATO, and headed by an ethnic Albanian leader. There's an effort to court the minority parties, I think still DPS, but also from the opposition to potentially bring more minority parties on board if they have that opportunity. And so I think there's, for us to pay attention and help Montenegro understand its responsibility as an ally. We don't want to see the NAC turned into a direct spy channel for Russian interests. But I think more importantly, we don't want to see a Montenegro that uses its position to block a consensus-based organization on key issues. And so who holds those national security portfolios will be very important and will be watched closely. I also think other regional issues. Montenegro has been really an incredible partner regionally, helping to promote calm and cooperation in a region that is prone to hyperbole and in the past conflict. And Montenegro has been a real force for good in that sense. And so I think obviously there will be some musings about, for example, derecognition of Kosovo, which I think would be very destabilizing. But I don't think you're going to see sufficient support across the political spectrum to play that kind of disruptive role. And I think while there's a commitment to the EU reform process, I think the EU needs to stay engaged to ensure that implementing reforms doesn't become selective justice, a sense of revenge, and whether Montenegro is able to stay associated with EU foreign policy decisions. For example, what will the EU do in the wake of Navalny's poisoning, and will Montenegro stand by EU foreign policy decisions? So finally, I would just say that there is a little bit of context to this that's worth thinking about. This region has been struck by extraordinary political polarization. Look on the streets of Belgrade and Tirana, across the region, Skopje, Montenegro as well. We've seen a tradition of boycotting parliaments, of the institutions not working. And I think that's not been healthy for the region, for democratic development, for our interests there. But I think there's also a bigger context, and it's us. It's the West, it's Europe, it's the United States, where we have our own populist backlashes, our own struggles. And so I think in some respects, you've seen even in a country like Montenegro, the 2016 coup in part could happen because we maybe weren't really paying that much attention or all that engaged. And I think this is really a sign that when there's a little bit of unhealthiness in the core of Western democracies, the periphery is going to actually pay some consequences, and you'll see that reverberate. So I think one of the things that we have going here is how we grapple with ourselves at home, how we struggle with strengthening our own democracy and renewal at home, and how that's going to put us in a position to have a stronger, better engagement in the Western Balkans going forward, and that we won't be absent. And finally, I'll just say there could be a silver lining here. I mean, part of this was a falling out between Djukanovic and Vučić, and really Belgrade giving oxygen, political advice and financing to the opposition here. But at the same time, over time, the big issue is, how does Serbia find its place in the region? How does Serbia find its place in Europe? And how does Serbia find its place with the United States in a normal partnership? In fact, ultimately, potentially a strategic partnership. Maybe one of the silver linings is this is an opportunity to continue to help those that are sympathetic to Serbian interests or Serbia itself understand how to work with NATO and how to work more closely with the United States. We'll see. But I like to find the opportunity in adversity. So back to you, Valerie.
Thank you very much, Damon, for zeroing in so concretely on what's happening in Montenegro and placing it in this wider and complicated context in which I do think, you know, this polarization and this West taking its eye off the ball gives space for external actors to even minimally interfere with bigger repercussions, perhaps. And I will not abuse my position as chair for the whole period by asking too many questions, but I want to, before I start seeing questions, I want to tell the audience, I think this is a small and intimate group of people, you can either raise your hand and ask your own question on video, you can send a question on the chat. I do not intend to monopolize this. I have lots of opportunities or not necessarily enough, but plenty of opportunities to ask my questions. So please feel free to join the discussion. But I will ask, I mean, the Atlantic Council in Montenegro, Damon, has a pretty robust digital forensics center. What is it? Digital Forensic Center, yeah? And I'm receiving, what have your colleagues relayed to you in terms of the perceptions of any foreign influence in this election?
Sure, I had the chance to talk with some of those colleagues and follow some of their work. You know, this is a mix. There's no doubt that there is we've seen through journalism channels, we've seen through utility companies, we've seen through religious institutions, how they have been conduits both for foreign financing into Montenegro, both in the past and likely in this situation. And I think the folks that I have been talking to on the ground clearly see evidence of that, and clearly see sort of a concerted effort, a concerted campaign. After all, the Democratic Front years ago went from being the most marginal actor to having the resources to be able to grow into the leading opposition. I think we've got to recognize that. We've got to defend open societies against this type of influence. But we can't also just make it the only boogeyman. This election didn't just happen because of foreign influence. There are circumstances in Montenegro that drove people to vote this way. We know that. And I think many of my colleagues who also have been in government or in DPS there actually acknowledge that as well. But what is clear is that there was a concerted effort on one side to really pump up the capabilities and help tip the scale. And there was some success this time.
Do you want to call out any specific foreign actors? Are we talking about Moscow? Are we talking about Belgrade? Are we talking about somebody else?
Well, look, from everything that I have seen and heard from my colleagues right now does point to active engagement from Russian sympathetic actors, church sympathetic actors, but really based in Belgrade. And really in some respects through the Serbian Orthodox Church as a vehicle through which interests in Belgrade could help promote some of that. That said, this is actually, you know, could reverberate in Serbia itself, where there are its own internal dynamics and politics between the government, between Vučić and the church as well. So I think there's some complicated knock-on effects that could flow from this. It is clear, and we saw in 2016, pretty unrefutable evidence of GRU direct involvement. I think we're still looking at what's unfolded here in Montenegro this time. But there were very, very clear fingerprints of the GRU, Russian military intelligence services in 2016. Two agents, in fact, convicted in Montenegro courts, two leaders of Democratic Front spending time right now. So we've seen a little bit of the playbook. We've seen that track record, both through overt involvement as well as through some of the financial channels in the past. And so I think it's safe to say that some of this has been tested and tried before. I just wouldn't put the whole results of what's played out in Montenegro at the foot of foreign intervention. I think there is a more complicated dynamic unfolding. And in some respects, so I don't want to over-exaggerate that role either.
That's great. I think that's very fair. Not that
if I could, Valerie, if I could just add to what Damon said, because I agree with him very much. There's a lot of aspects to Serb-Montenegrin relations that also bear on the broader Orthodox Christian world. The Serbian Orthodox Church has had a dominant position in Montenegro, at least since the beginning of the last century. And since then, there's been a conflict, and this has accelerated since independence between the Montenegrin Orthodox Church and the Serbian Orthodox Church, the former wanting to be the autocephalous, at least get recognition as the autocephalous Church of Montenegro. So this is a long-running conflict in Montenegrin history and in its relations to Serbia and the broader Orthodox world. So I wanted to point that out as well. It's not necessarily about influence, but also these aspects, which echo also Ukraine's efforts to have its own autocephalous church as well.
Well, I think you just need to underscore that, I mean, that we've seen what happened in Ukraine. You've seen this playing out in North Macedonia. You've seen there were a lot of vested interests very intent on not letting this happen in Montenegro.
Absolutely. And Paul, I actually wanted to come back to you too and ask you, you know, we saw this year that Freedom House made 3 very big jumps in 3 countries that I cover, Hungary, Montenegro, and Serbia, classifying them not as democracies anymore, but as hybrid regimes. Does this election show that maybe that was too soon for Montenegro's case, even though it had never changed power democratically? Or, you know, is the state of democracy much more robust than we thought, or did it just take such a big drastic event due to a rise in nationalism? I mean, how rosy should we be about the prospect of a change and what it means for the democratic institutions?
Well, certainly these elections are a boon for greater political pluralism, as I pointed out. So I think that's the positive side of the ledger. We talked about what drove these things, and I think it's the law on freedom of religion certainly galvanized an opposition in the way that it hadn't been galvanized before. I think a lot of unforeseen things, not the least of which is the COVID pandemic, which has undermined economies throughout the world. Including Montenegro's, and I think that drove it as well. As far as being optimistic, we'll just have to see. I think one aspect of the hybrid regime that we'll have to keep an eye on is the DPS's control of many levers of power that are outside the elected realm, and I'm thinking mainly on internal security and so forth. Also, its overweening control of the media, for example. It would be good to see an opening up of that. So a lot of these things, as I said at the outset, and as we've all said, this was a big surprise, and I'm sure Freedom House is surprised as well with this, but we're going to have to see. But certainly as far as political pluralism is concerned, this is definitely a positive.
Thank you, Paul. I see a lot of longtime Balkan watchers out there. I'm sure that a lot of you have questions that are better than mine. So I would urge you to either raise your hand or send them in the chat. If I were a teacher, I'd be very disappointed right now, but I'm not. So I guess it's okay. But I will continue with my questions. And maybe we can, I mean, how worried can we be that in many of the countries now that emerged from the former Yugoslavia, maybe with the exception of Serbia, in Macedonia, in Kosovo, in Montenegro, for sure, we see now that these teeny tiny, for the most part, teeny tiny, ethnic-based minority parties are emerging as kingmakers. And I wonder, you know, what is on the one hand, of course, it gives a very stronger voice and role and importance and priority to minority rights. But on the other hand, I wonder, you know, what is your assessment of what kind of role that could play in terms of potentially increasing tensions or frustrations or resentments in the region? I don't know who wants to take that. Damon, maybe
Sure.
you. And, yeah.
Sure. I mean, to be honest, the night of the election, talking to some colleagues across the country, I mean, this was what's concerned them most, was the tenor and the nature, first of some of the nationalist rhetoric that had been used during the campaign and that was being piped into the campaign. But just the nature of some of the celebrations, understandable. This is like a big deal, tectonic shift, so you would expect major reactions on the streets. But the tone of them, the chance of them, some of the incidents that turned ugly, where we had some anti-Muslim graffiti, some violent incidents, a couple of here and there, Serbian nationalist overtones to some of these, really brought back difficult memories for people that remembered the early 90s and just the tone of what sent the region into a tailspin. Now, I'm not prepared to say that's where we are, but it was enough to make folks that I know who have been struggling for democracy and freedom in their countries and their societies, that believe in their country's place in Europe. It made them uneasy to sort of feel and hear and see some of this. I would say there's so many people that are in this room, the Zoom room with us, that actually know this in some respects much better than me. I'd love to get their reactions through this throughout. But it's also not the early 90s. And if you step back and see what's happened, we have seen this cycle of progress despite challenges, of Montenegro joining the NATO alliance, of a PRESPA agreement between Athens and Skopje that is paving the way to accelerate North Macedonia's place, certainly now in NATO, but along the pathway to the EU. And while we've been in fits and starts, we have an actual dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina on the big issue in the region. Doesn't mean this is all good. It's not. We've got real challenges. But it does mean that we're not in the early 90s where we were in a descent downward with no trajectory. We know where we want to go. We've got fits and starts and problems and challenges beginning with ourselves. But it's a really different context. And so I'm hoping that, yes, while some of the sentiments are there that are raw, that might disturb or intimidate minorities or others, it means it makes it incumbent upon the political leaders to lead, to speak out, and to help shape this in the right direction, and all eyes will be on them. Some of them have said some reassuring things. We need to see that sustained and acted upon in a real way to gain confidence across these communities. But the context is a bit different, and there are more guardrails today. There is a sense of where we should go, rather than a real uncertainty that we're looking over an abyss. It's not the same feeling.
Indeed, indeed. Although, I mean, many of the same politicians remain, including Mr. Djukanovic, but also some of the key opposition leaders, one of whom I think served as Milosevic's ambassador during the time of Yugoslavia, many others who opposed the independence of the country, not to mention the membership in NATO. And I agree that it will be very interesting to watch how they honor the commitment that they've made to remain in these parties. And I mean, I'm also wondering, Paul, what your assessment is in terms, with all of your experience in working in new democracies, when you see a transition of power after so much time, and after one party has been largely in charge for so long, of course, there's a lot of energy and momentum, but Montenegro has opened in the last 8 years. I think it's closed only 3 chapters of the EU acquis. I mean, I think Croatia closed them all in a span of 6 or 7 years, and then became a member. So, are you confident that that Montenegro can maintain at least its nominal status now as a front runner for EU membership?
Well, the opposition has said that it's going to remain committed to the EU path, and is going to do what's necessary. I just want to say a few words about democratic transitions, particularly those where a particular political party or force has been in power for so long. Expectations are probably enormous on the opposition supporters' side right now, and it's often difficult for governments that are coming in to meet those expectations. despite what we've heard from the opposition, I'm concerned that the supporters, particularly of the For the Future of Montenegro coalition, are expecting something that may not be good for Montenegro's EU accession down the road. And that's what I'm most concerned about right now. But in government formation, for me, it's going to be really interesting to see if this black on white coalition within the broader opposition coalition has a moderating influence on the other two coalitions, particularly the most pro-Russian part of it moving forward. And it's ironic that I'm kind of split on this. On the one hand, for EU's path, I'm thinking perhaps maybe this party should go with the DPS to continue that path, knowing that the DPS has had such a stranglehold on the economy, there's overweening corruption and so forth. But then I also think that perhaps with the opposition coalitions coming in, that they could have a mediating influence on the other parties. So that's yet to be seen. I will have to take the opposition at their word that they will live up to Montenegro's existing international commitments moving forward and hope for the best.
And just as a follow-up on that, I mean, in your experience with these democratic transitions, I mean, what can you say about the kind of fragmented nature? I mean, as I understand, these three opposition blocs are actually consisting of 20 parties. I mean, do you, and the people who are cheering the results in Montenegro now are saying, you know, this will have a moderating effect, they will need to focus on experts and things like that. But in your experience, maybe in other countries, when you have this many different parties and personalities, is it possible to sort of march forward, move ahead swiftly and efficiently enough?
It's certainly difficult. And it always seems to be that way. I'm thinking of Serbia's own transition back 20 years now, where the opposition really had to park its ambitions and misgivings about one another within the coalition to really move it forward. And although the president and prime minister, the president in Serbia's case that emerged was nobody's first choice, sometimes they have to make difficult compromises to move forward. So I'm not going to prognosticate. There are too many moving parts, as you pointed out yourself, with so many parties in this coalition. But what's important, and again, I'm thinking back to Serbia 20 years ago when I was working at the National Endowment for Democracy, helping the Serbian opposition. And I have to say, we never thought that they would bring it together given all the differences that they had, but in the end they did. So what we're talking about here, though, is there are concerns about this, the opposition coming to power in Montenegro, as we mentioned. So it's going to be interesting to see how much support, let's say, rhetorical, diplomatic, but also in the sense of assistance that this new opposition is going to receive from the outside moving forward. That's also a crucial factor in all of this. It depends in part on what the opposition itself does.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think there's no questions from the audience still. I don't mean to call everybody out, but just saying, I've got plenty of them. And in fact, I would like to maybe move to a bit more regional discussion. I think it would be remiss if we did not mention the meeting that's happening in DC today and tomorrow at the White House between leaders of Kosovo and Serbia. But I will ask a bridge question first about the region in general, because Damon, you said something very interesting about the role that the DPS, especially under Djukanovic's leadership, played in trying to stabilize the region and work with the region. And it struck me that in a recent interview I had with President Vučić, he was accusing Djukanovic and Montenegro of abandoning the region, of leaving it alone, of trying to like go and hang out with its cool like Western club or whatever. And so I thought at the same time, you know, Vučić is one of the key champions of a European regional economic area, or so-called mini Schengen, whatever we want to call it. And I wonder if maybe you can unpack a little bit how you see Podgorica's and Belgrade's different regional approaches, and maybe where they can better, why they have diverged, and maybe where they can better realign.
Sure.
And then we can talk about Kosovo, Serbia.
I'll take that on, Valerie. And I do think I see flagging from Tucker Jones and Graham Scott that they might have comments, questions. So I think you've got some there too, Valerie. But sure, yes. Look, I mean, Montenegro, certainly up until election day, we really cherished its place as being the front runner in the EU accession process. And, you know, it's a small country, 600,000 people. I talked to them a lot during the process of NATO enlargement, and knew at that time, they had to focus, execute, and deliver. And if they were serious about trying to join the alliance, they had to show us they were serious. And in a country of 600,000, you don't want to overestimate all the assets, resources, human capital you can bring to bear. And so really, they've been in that mindset that the EU is it, that's their priority, that's their number one priority, and they're putting all effort to it. I think it's also coupled with a sense, and for someone like Vučić, the EU process, important while it might be, is a bit more distant. And so, you know, I'm a supporter of what we were trying to do to promote regional economic development and further integrating the region of the Western Balkans long before they'll be integrated into the European Union. I think that's a smart move to create that kind of market. But when you bring politics into it and a falling out between Vučić and Đukanović, an understanding of the scale and size of Serbia's economy, and a lack of trust, which is a fundamental issue that pervades across the Balkans, a lack of trust led Đukanović to say, I think I need to take a step back from this effort, this initiative that Vučić is a real champion of. And I felt that myself when the Atlantic Council played host to one of the summits just a few weeks ago. President Đukanović did not join us, but sent his Minister of Economy. And I think that was part of the rationale. So this underscores why the role and the cooperation of the US and the EU together is important, because we need the parties, we need the agency of the actors on the ground themselves to do this, but they need us to be engaged with to give them a sense of confidence about being able to trust each other and where this is going. And I think when that breaks down, when the US and EU are not engaged, take their eye off the ball, or not engaged in a coherent way, it only fans the oxygen that's available for some of this mistrust in the region and plays to that negative side. So you've seen different approaches that have played out between Belgrade and Podgorica, no doubt. And while the reality is, I think, yes, you want Montenegro absolutely focused on accelerating its EU accession process, but in a way that can be compatible, recognizing that as the region improves, reforms, and advances, it's going to be good. It's not a zero-sum game here. It's going to be good for the region.
Great. Thank you so much. We actually thankfully have two brave hand raisers. Maybe we can take both questions at once. So maybe we go first to Graham Scott and then to Tucker Jones. I've just politely asked to unmute you. So good, you're unmuted. Graham, go ahead, take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Valerie. Thanks, Damon, and to Paul as well. My question is, assuming that DPS does go into opposition, what does the future of that party look like? How much change can we expect to see within the party? Is there going to be a more of a major reconsideration of leadership and of the direction of the party, or are things going to maintain more as they have been?
Thanks, Graham. Tucker, what about you?
Thanks. This question is possibly better suited toward Damon, although Paul, you are of course welcome to answer it as well. It looks like the US got itself, and the West broadly, got ourselves into a tough dilemma in this situation between a rock and a hard place. The ostensibly democratic opposition that recently narrowly won these elections is generally pretty anti-West, and has, as we've discussed, some pretty troubling nationalist characteristics. That being said, the presumptively outgoing government maintained its power for longer than I've been alive, and got that power, maintained it, also using undemocratic means. This is not the first time that the US has got ourselves pinned in this sort of situation. What can the US do to keep ourselves from getting stuck with this dilemma in future cases?
Thank you. Who wants to answer first?
I can take the future DPS. Damon, if you want to take the second question, that would be great. Yeah, it's going to be very interesting. It's going to be DPS, if it does indeed go through a transition internally, which I think is still a big question mark. It's going to be a very difficult transition. The party is very much tied to the personality of the president, Jukanovic, and reform is going to be very difficult. The reason I think reform is unlikely right now is that the result was so tight. It was the opposition won by a razor-thin majority, and that is not necessarily going to force people inside the DPS to contest Jukanovic's power. In fact, I think there's going to be a rallying effect around the president to fight for their position in the face of the opposition challenge moving forward. The other thing is there is a lot of money tied up in this. And the party and Jukanovic himself control a lot of economic levers in the country that they're not going to give up quite so easily, which will play into what happens in the process of government formation. So I don't see the DPS changing soon, and maybe not in this round. But as I said in my comments, there's a possibility that we may see a situation, God help us, I hope it's not like Israel, but that you see a number of elections taking place until the situation is resolved. I can see a situation where an agreement is not reached and the new election is forced. I can't see DPS changing during that time.
Thank you. Damon?
Thanks. I might just add on that question. I think you're going to this is not static. It's very dynamic. I think you're going to continue to see significant political realignment in Montenegro, certainly with a potential coalition government that has extraordinarily diverse views. That's not a natural set of governing partners. They were united in anything but DPS. But also in DPS, I agree with Paul in the short term, but I think longer term, for so long, there have been a lot of people who there just weren't a lot of other options for them. And so they became involved in government through DPS, but really were frustrated at the lack of reform, wanted to see a greater pace of reform inside the party. And so I think there's going to be political realignment that's going to play out in the country quite substantially, because these are not quite natural coalitions. We have to remember 600,000 people. They all know each other. They've got cousins in business, and it's tricky. It's really tricky when you're interwoven this way. It's oftentimes you'll peel back a story and understand that there's really something kind of parochial that's driving a particular dispute. On the bigger question, I'm actually pretty confident. I mean, I feel like thank God this is happening in the context of a country that has a sense of security around its sovereignty, around its independence, around what it is. It makes it risky, it does, but on the other hand, a Montenegro, a Balkans region that was just outside, had no hope of being connected to Europe and NATO, and where we really were truly disengaged, these types of differences easily could have or probably would spill into violence and conflict and greater tensions. There's a little bit of a blanket of security that creates the habits of cooperation, the habits of expectation. And while they are not fully ingrained, I've watched this over and over through the NATO enlargement process, through the EU acquis process. But it sets certain limits in people's minds of what's going to be able to happen, what does happen. Now we see limits being challenged everywhere. I'm not naive about that. We look at our own president's approaches to conventional things here. But at this level, I'm actually reassured that because Montenegro is in NATO, and because it is surrounded by, has neighbors, whether North Macedonia, Albania, where there are Croatia that are part of NATO, part of the European Union for Croatia, and that sees a Serbia that is actually building probably the closest relationship we've had with the United States right now, and where we retain a real foothold and presence in Kosovo. I think this helps keep some limits on things like this being able to spiral. And so I take the point, absolutely. That's why we have to pay attention to how they operate within the alliance, who holds some of the national security portfolios. But on the other hand, I think we've created some guardrails here that prevent this from becoming something that could be more dangerous or more discouraging, and are going to help habituate. We need to understand that we've got permanent relationships with these countries. We need to have normal relationships across the political spectrum. This will be with fits and starts, but I think it's actually an important and healthy process.
If I could just add one element of worry, I hate to be the sad face in all of these. I completely agree with Damon. One thing that concerns me is Montenegro's relations with Kosovo moving forward, with a pro-Serb element in a majority within the opposition moving forward. It is going to be very important that the international community, the West, NATO, the European Union, leans on a new government to keep its commitments, the recognition of Kosovo being one of the most important, but also to be supporting the dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina moving forward. So I would just add that, which can only help the commitments and the peace in the region that Damon described. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. We have another question, I think, for both of you from Damian Murphy, who is asking about what levers of power Djukanovic can exercise in the event that the new government does decide to diverge from its NATO or EU path. According to the Constitution, it appears that Djukanovic's powers are pretty limited, but Damien says he would be interested to hear folks' perspectives on what that means in practice. Mm-hmm. Anyone's been studying the presidential powers of the Montenegrin Constitution?
And Damian, I'd also welcome your thoughts, Damian, if you want to add to this, because I think this is where we have not been as sophisticated as we need to be about projecting positive influence, and in part because we're in our own funk here at home. But Djukanovic himself, I think the presidential powers, and I'm not a constitutional expert, I'm sure there are people on this call that know that better than me in Montenegro, but it's traditionally not been the source of center of power, a more, I don't want to call it fully ceremonial, but the authority and power has been within the government and the prime minister. The personality of Djukanovic has given the presidency an outsized influence and role because of what he's exercised in the country and obviously in DPS. And so he's got the power of the bully pulpit. He's got the track record of strong support. I mean, look, a strong track record, the regional relationships. He has been, if you deal with in the region, he is a statesman that has these types of relationships internationally, that still has standing with a swath of the public, and that still has a strong political base within the parliament. And so I think it's going to be a combination of the bully pulpit of the presidency, some of the powers of where he can block or not, but also the soft powers, if you will, of still working through his party structures and those that remain loyal to him. I think the bigger question, and Damian, you've hit on it, and we've worked with this in a range of ways, is what is our leverage? And I think ultimately this is where I think competing for positive influence, there are negative channels that we've had available from sanctions and things like that. But I also am really keen, as we've adapted through the BUILD Act, our way to get involved with DFC and investments, how we are using greater tools to compete positively to show the benefits of actually moving forward on a reform agenda and meeting NATO and EU commitments and spelling out the opportunities that can flow from that. And in cases, the consequences of diverging from that. It's something where I think we've got more work to do. And I'd be interested in how you see this up from the congressional perspective.
Damian, are you going to show yourself?
Sure.
Oh, good.
Hey guys. Yeah, no, I agree, Damon. I think bringing those, kind of positive tools that we have to bear is really important, right? And it's, it's the Build Act. It's, what more we can be doing through things like the 3 Cs initiative. There's also this ERIP program that the State Department engaged or initiated in the last couple of years that helps countries that have former Soviet military equipment transition away from that, right? So, I mean, I think there's a lot of tools that can definitely be brought to bear. I think that what we haven't seen, though, in a way, as a robust way as I'd like to see, and I imagine others on the Zoom call would also like to see, is that more sort of diplomatic engagement, not only from our diplomats, but from our political leadership, right? And the Hill is a big piece of that. And we've seen, some engagement from people like Senator Menendez, Senator Johnson, Senator Murphy. Shaheen has been a big player in all of this for years now. But it's certainly not nearly as robust as it used to be back in the old days, back in the 90s, back when, the Balkans was very much, on the map of policymakers. So I think that, maybe if we see some forward movement on Serbia, Kosovo, if, members of Congress do see a value in engaging in a place like Montenegro, as, potentially it might head in a path that we don't want to see. We could see more of that engagement. And then, of course, if there's, a new administration, that also provides an opportunity for, rethinking all of this and re-engaging in sort of a fresh way.
Let me just say a quick word, because Damian, yes, some of the tools that Congress has been developing, those help. But I think what you said is quite important. You can't underestimate the power of just showing up and being there and competing. And we've gone through this. I went through this process in NATO enlargement earlier. And to watch the way we handled Montenegro was vastly different from previous rounds. We almost were observers to their process rather than really invested in actors in helping them achieve their goals. We had some incidents around certain appointees in the intelligence space that caused concern. And the way we handled it was almost as if we were just watching from the outside saying, this isn't really good. Well, that's certainly not how we worked with our partners when they were going through NATO enlargement in the earlier stages. This is a country of 600,000 people. The politicians like to be met, they like to be respected. It's why with the Atlantic Council, we always try to go and show up and go meet people. In fact, I relentlessly asked to meet the Democratic Front the past couple of times I was there. And some of them said no, because I just think we have to compete and engage and be present. The reason we had an attempted coup in Montenegro is because I think there was a sense that it might be possible. And with a little bit of effort, it might be possible. I believe with a little bit of effort on our part to exert our values and our interests, which align in this situation, that we can keep this within the guardrails. But you gotta actually care, and you gotta try. And I think it's important that the folks at the political level understand our interests. I remember in the enlargement days, and I'll close with this, that to get the Senate to vote on enlargement, it's a treaty. It's hard. Rand Paul doesn't want any treaties to go through the Senate. And it was some discussions with Senate leadership to help understand that this might be a small country in the Balkans. It might not be important enough to have to call a vote that's really going to take up 3 days of debate on the Senate calendar. On the other hand, if we blink, if we trip, if we fail, this is part of a much bigger game where people are looking to show that America's absent so they can undermine us, and that our adversaries will take this for advantage. And we ended up doing the right thing and acting well. And I think this is a moment that just reminds us that despite our challenges at home, we are complex enough, sophisticated enough, and we're unified enough across partisan lines on issues like this that we actually need to be in the game and exert a positive force, and don't just leave that to a professional diplomat in the field.
Thank you so much, Damon. And we are running up now over an hour, but I just want to let you both have a chance to make maybe some concluding remarks. Although your remark there was quite quite a, what is the word I'm looking for? It's right at the end of the song, you know, the tonic note, is it? Paul, do you want to make any final remarks?
I think the word coda, maybe coda is the one you're looking for, Valerie. I don't know, I'm not a music expert, but I just to go back to what Damian, it's great to have you on the call and great to see you again, but also what Damon said in response. I think the challenge is not only for Montenegro, but it's also for the West, broadly speaking. We got used to having Đukanović around and relying on that. In a way, it was a kind of one-stop shop for all of these issues moving forward. And now we're presented with a challenge where there's going to be a multipolarity in the political scene in Montenegro. And we're going to have to step up to the plate and deal with the various factions that are emerging there to keep Montenegro on its Euro-Atlantic path. It's going to be absolutely necessary.
Thank you, Paul.
I would just close by saying, look, Montenegro is our ally. We need to be engaged, stand with it, stand by our ally, and help it succeed. Over time, I think people will understand that the thing I think is beautiful about some of our interests and objectives in this region is that we're trying to help build and help the people of the region build a better future in which they can find themselves in a more secure environment and provide economies where people can actually stay home and have jobs and raise families. Our adversaries, and in this case, Russia's objectives in this region have been to tear down and to instrumentalize, you know, in some respects, to use a country like Montenegro to get at us, at the United States. And that's not really how we roll. It's not really how we play. And so over time, this is going to be bumpy. This is the Balkans. We got real issues. I've got really serious concerns about some of the actors that could find their way into this new government. No doubt about that. On the other hand, I'm confident over the long term that a more open, pluralistic process and system in Montenegro, a more honest conversation, in the context of a country that is part of the NATO alliance, that will make this work. It will be one of the challenges. And I think at the end of the day, I'm pretty confident that Montenegro has the potential to come out of this much, much stronger, but it's not going to be a linear path, and we need to stand by them and be an ally through this process, not turn our back right now.
Thank you so much, Damon. Thank you, Paul. Thank you to all the participants who have been here through this whole time with your great questions and comments. Thank you both to the Atlantic Council and to IRI for inviting me to moderate this panel. It was very interesting, and I think it's going to be formative for my reporting as I go forward on Montenegro as well. So have a great afternoon or evening, depending on where you all are, and hope to see you back here soon.
Thank you, Valerie, and thanks to all the guests today, and Paul, pretty much appreciated.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you, Damon.